Dispute management, like peace, is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to handle conflict. Hi there. Welcome to the JAIAC's Dispute Management in a New World podcast series. 40 minutes of bi-weekly conversations with Dr. Christopher Malcolm, dispute management professional, academician, international legal consultant, entrepreneurial visionary, and Secretary General of the Jamaica International Arbitration Center, JAIAC. I'm your host, Anika Nelson. Thank you for joining us. Today, we continue our conversation about the dispute management COVID-19 pandemic implications. Dr. Malcolm, before we go ahead, let's do a quick recap of some of the points that we highlighted in part one of the series.
In part one, as you recall, one of the things we tried to do then was to look at some of the emerging implications that we've seen coming out of the COVID pandemic, some of the ways that we could, going forward, seek to deal with those. We found that persons were faced with circumstances they hadn't planned for, and which were quite unique to all of us. There was no one who could have guessed 5, 6, 2, 3, however many years prior
20
that we would have had anything of the like that would have affected us to the extent that it has. And as we recall as well, just if we were to think about it a little bit, when we initially had news that there was this emerging issue of COVID, there were many who thought that it would have been confined and would not have hit us in the sort of pandemic way that we have seen it. Lo and behold, we have looked beyond that. We've seen something else, and we've seen a situation where not only has it hit us in ways that we never imagined, but every time we think that we are dealing with it, there's a morphing and a new way that we have to re-examine what we're doing to try to adapt and to be able to simply live our lives, which is what has been happening. Now, from a dispute management perspective, if we're to center it in this context, what we saw happening is that a lot of arrangements that were entered were all entered, particularly where they involve cross-border transactions and businesses which were required to continue in that context. They were entered in an arrangement where you had established trade routes, you had established ways of doing things, and for the most part, those established ways required face-to-face contact, or much of it had to be face-to-face. There were travel linkages that were critical. There were ways of negotiating that relied upon that. And we simply had over time become accustomed to a way where if I do not eyeball you, I do not sometimes have any desire to even trust you. But what COVID-19 has done is got us to a point where if you are to eyeball people at all, it is being done online rather than face-to-face. So a lot of the little nuances that we had become used to and accustomed to, we're no longer able to rely upon. But in that now, what has happened is that because of this new dispensation, if we were to call it that, you have a situation where persons have to start thinking a little out of the box. What can I now do? How do I deal with this situation that I have absolutely no control over? How will it impact my business? What adjustments do I have to make now and possibly into the future? And one of the things that I've seen, certainly as a lawyer, is that persons are now, for example, revisiting contracts and including provisions that are not just related to COVID-19, but the possibility that going forward you could have something similar to COVID-19, having the sort of debilitating impact that COVID has had. And what it has also shown us is that we are a lot more interdependent than some of us had even thought prior. So what COVID did, for example, is showed us that while we may have our individual business activities, and we may have recognized that we were reliant on others for them to develop, we now had a situation emerging where everybody, regardless of who they were, rich, poor, in between, were suffering losses as a result of COVID-19. And the question is, how do we then deal with those? How do we redistribute losses or distribute them in a way that is fair, in a way that is reasonable, and in a way that will allow us to have the business continuity we require, and in a way that will allow us as well to maintain relationships. So what COVID-19 therefore then did, if we go back to it, was that it required of us to revisit existing relationships. It required of us to conduct performance and other audits if we hadn't done them prior.
True.
It required of us to re-engage as to how we resolve inevitable disputes. And it required of us to understand that some of the systems, for example, the courts that we had traditionally relied upon, could no longer assist us the way they did. And why did the courts take an impact in this significant way? Because the courts are generally designed to encourage and support significant face-to-face interactions. But when COVID came about, you had a situation there where courts, many of them were shuttered completely altogether.
Yes, they were.
And others, if not shuttered, realized that they had to be giving very limited service to persons. So you had significant backlogs in your court systems developing, and you had a situation where people could not, in real time, and with the levels of comfort that they required, simply go to the court for a decision to be made. It just didn't happen.
Yes.
So what then had to happen is that people now had to start thinking, how do we pivot more to online, for example? How do we pivot to hybrid systems which use online and which use the court systems as well to the maximum extent possible? And how do the court systems recognize that online, even if they had not yet got there, and some had in fairness, were much further along than others, how do we ensure that we introduce elements of our processes that could allow for a more seamless functioning of online? And another thing which is critical, how do you get persons who were, some of them, distrusting of technology, some of them distrusting of not being able to integrally and intimately see things and be involved in the arena of the process? How did you get them to re-engage themselves and to start trusting a process that many of them did not know about? And there were some persons, depending on what you did, who were simply averse to technology that now had to get up to speed. How do lawyers, for example, some of whom had simply operated on the basis of everything in hard copies, everything by reference to what I can see on a piece of paper. How did you get those persons to now engage in a process where you very often wouldn't have black and white? And even if you did, it would require you to get it, print it, and deal with it. But in a system where, for example, when you're dealing with a resolution of a dispute, you are simply looking at somebody on a screen who may have been 1,000 miles away or even more. How did we get to those? So coming out of that experience, we recognized that we now had to look at systems that allowed for online. But we also had to look at something else. We had to recognize that with the need for redistribution of losses and with the need for saying that we all are suffering. There's no one suffering. Some are suffering more than others, depending on economic circumstances, of course. But we all are suffering to one level or another. How did we get to recognizing that the adversarial way of things, we had to move away from that a little bit to things which are a lot more conducive to amicable discussions, conducive to mediated settlements, conducive to facilitated renegotiation of existing contracts. Those are some of the lessons that we had, and persons had to literally come up to speed very quickly. So those who did not spend a lot of time prior looking at alternatives to the court system suddenly found that they had to go there. And even within the court system, courts that had not yet sought to digitize a lot of their processes recognized that they had to now do it or be left behind in their capacities to be able to provide good service to the persons that they serve.
You've just given us quite a number of points in terms of the implication. Were there other implications for businesses, not just domestic business operation, but international business operations? Well,
the truth is that whether you are in a domestic or in an international space, the problems pretty much are the same. Where you're talking about international, and when I suspect when you're speaking about international, we're talking about persons who then take their business across borders.
Right.
So, for example, a business in Germany having to do business with another in South Africa,
right,
or some such thing.
Right.
How were those particularly impacted? And we know at the beginning, for example, you had impacts relating to shipping lines. You had impacts related to provision of services and support, so on. Because we need to break this down a little bit. For persons who don't understand well enough, we understand that there's a global supply chain where you have input suppliers and you have off-takers of services and goods and services that are produced. Now, in that context, we have long moved beyond a space where there's any single economy or country that produces all that they need. We have now got to a point where you have inputs from various places all coming together, being assembled and so on in overall products and services, which are then made available. So once you are now talking about having to deal with persons online and across borders, you now had to re-engage. So the impact for businesses, some of them included, that end product makers were now being depleted of the inputs that they required to produce their goods. And part of the reason for that is not simply because shipping lines and so on were down, but you had implications where in some countries and in many, you had a situation where you had lockdowns. You had restrictions on travel. You had restrictions on even leaving your homes. So in those circumstances, even where the products could have been made available, the inputs required, you had a situation where the persons who were supposed to build them, the human resources, were simply not available and limited. You had even now, if I were to take just a quick one, we have looked, for example, at vaccination and vaccines being produced that we hear this is the way for us to move forward out of this pandemic. But what we have also seen is a situation where there's a shortage of vaccines that are available, scarcity at all levels. And part of that is simply because the demand is outstripping the supply.
Yes, it is.
And in circumstances, for example, let's take India. India is known and recognized as a jurisdiction which produces a lot of the world's medicines. But in India, they've had all sorts of upticks in pandemic-related issues and so on. And their own supplies are not able to reach where they used to reach. And they're simply not able to meet demand as they were able to before.
So supply and distribution.
Supply and distribution chains have been affected. And ultimately, once those are affected, what happens? You come to disputes that are in the making. Because if I have a contractual relationship with you that says that you're to produce a good for me by the 23rd of, let's say, January, to call a month. And on the 19th of January, you come to me to say, sorry, I won't be able to produce it until the 15th of April. Then in that situation, what do you have? Not only are you putting me in a position where I cannot then produce my good or service, but the very real likelihood is that there's a ripple because I have other persons that I must then supply my good or service to. And so the ripple effect continues. So you now have, instead of a single dispute having arisen, and that is where the pandemic implications become, because you now have a situation where a single break in the chain will have multiple impacts on several persons to an extent that we haven't even considered in some instances. Because what is clear is that when things are going well, you don't spend the time to think of the ripples.
True.
It is when they start going bad and you start scratching your head and say, my God, are these all the persons who could be impacted by what I do or don't do? And what we have seen coming out of this is that we are recognizing just how far the ripples travel and just how much it is that we need to start re-examining what we do and understanding that we all have to find a way to share in the problems that have been created over which we have no control, and to share also, if we can, in the solutions that we may be able to devise.
That's a good point on which to move to the next question, which is what exactly can businesses do to prevent those, well, not so much prevent, but to manage the ripple effects?
There are some things you have very limited control over managing. Disputes are things which will always happen. And because you know they will happen, they're pretty much like a contingent liability on a balance sheet. You put contingencies in place to deal with some of the things that could happen, but even if they do not ultimately manifest. So what does that require for businesses? Businesses need to start recognizing, if they haven't yet done so, that when you're thinking of a product or service, in the same way you start thinking of getting your economist on board, your accountants on board, your technical people on board to help you to devise a product or service and to craft it and to do whatever you need to do to bring it to market. You also need to start thinking very early that in this design, in this development, in the usage of the product or service, disputes are likely to happen. Let us break that down very quickly, if I may. So let's say, for example, you're building a product or service and you're relying on the intellectual property, the copyrights, trademarks, and so on. You have the possibility that somebody could breach those. What are the ripple effects if it is? How do you prevent, for example, put a system in place that will enable that You don't really have as many breaches, or if there are, you minimize them so that you don't end up having to go to court and people getting injunctions and so on. So that is one of the things that businesses need to do. They need to think in a real way about what it is that they need to do to avoid problems happening, one, and to ensure that they're seamlessly dealt with. And that takes me to something I learned very, very long ago. I remembered when I was learning project finance, legal aspects of project finance, one of the best bits of advice I got, that you must always think of a project that you're considering and when you're negotiating it as a situation where there's a handle and a blade to a knife. At some point in the relationship, the handle will be with you and the blade with the other person. But there comes a point in that relationship where there's going to be a switch. The blade will be with you and the handle with the other. And so the best thing always to do when you're negotiating, and this is where the management process and the foresight comes in, is to negotiate and try to put deals in place where when the person has the handle and you have the blade, there's no incentive on their part to see you in a dark alleyway and stick a knife in your back. Figuratively speaking, of course. But the point being made is that we have to think realistically of where fairness lies. Think realistically of the fact that anything being done now will have short, medium, and longer term impact. And how do you then put arrangements in place with that in mind? And a critical element of that is to recognize that however good your product or service is, however well considered your distribution links are, however well all those things are, there is always the possibility of a dispute. And you must always recognize that you can have all the money in the world. You can have all the distribution links in the world. If a dispute arises and it is not properly managed, notwithstanding all of those, you could get it thrown out the window, your product or your service. And in that context, those who are in the area, for example, of practicing insolvency will share, if they want to, that in many instances, businesses go under, not because of a want of financial arrangements, but because the arrangements in place for dispute management are not adequate.
That's an important point.
And that is something which, if businesses understand that well enough, they will do, which a lot of them do not do, quite frankly, sadly so, which is to ensure that at the moment they start conceptualizing their ideas, at the moment they start putting it together, they should also have persons coming on board with them who understand how to think the process of disputes, how to think where they could lie, how to think of how to identify possible disputes that could come up, how to think of how best to allocate them, and then ultimately to think of how to put systems in place that will effectively manage or mitigate the risks of disputes.
Is there a differentiation between what we are seeing in terms of disputes originating from our new online dispensation as opposed to some of the disputes that we would have seen in previous years?
Well, that again is a loaded question in this way. The mere fact that you go online with contracts where parties are all about, because an online relationship really creates its own problems. So there are disputes which will necessarily arise out of that. How do you manage data, for example?
Right.
How do you manage the fact that something may be in the cloud? What is the jurisdiction of the cloud? There are all of those issues which come about which have to be dealt with. But the fact is, there are some issues relating to ultimate good or service, which will always arise, whether you're online or in a physical space.
Right.
So we need to find a way to differentiate those disputes which are going to arise in an event and those which may be coming about as a result of a switch away from face-to-face to online. And when we understand them, then we can start thinking of effective ways to deal with them. And that is why there are these three critical words that I always rely on: IAM. It's about identification, and you need to spend a lot of time trying to identify possible risks. Then, having identified them, you need to find a fair and reasonable way to determine how best to allocate those risks between the parties. And the typical rule is that you allocate by reference to who is best able to manage the risk. And then ultimately, you need to understand that with the best process of identification and the best process of management, you will have instances where the dispute is going to spread over, or the risk identified rather is going to spill over into becoming a dispute.
Yes.
And you then need to find a way to ensure that you're able to seamlessly manage that dispute in the best way possible. Sometimes you end up not wanting to go there, but it being adversarial. But you ultimately want to keep away from things that are adversarial and to find much more amicable ways of dealing with disputes as and when they arise.
Doc, you said I am. Very important words that you want to resonate with our listeners and
Yes.
our viewers. Who is the I am when in terms of businesses? Whose responsibility is it ultimately to ensure that we have dispute management practices or policies in place?
Well, I am really relates to all parties concerned. But in the context, if we were to take a single business, company A,
Yes.
for example, policy really, if you think about company and how they're supposed to operate, policy derives from your board and other people who are in a decision-making capacity at that level. But you then have implementation that must go through the regular officers of the company and in their operational context. So the I am really properly considered should come about by reference to policy decisions. And then on, you need to have a clear communication from the policymakers to the implementers or the officers of the company, the persons who carry out day-to-day activities, the executives, to ensure that they take effective measures to implement. So what I would say, in short answer to that, is that it requires a business decision at an early stage where the parties involved in the running of the entity are made to understand how disputes are likely to manifest and what they could do. There are some companies which are large enough and have internal legal advisors and so on, who are in-house counsel, as we call them. There are others that don't have that luxury. But I would say whether you have the luxury of in-house advisors or you don't, it still is important for you to understand how it is that disputes, or a single one, could affect you. And as I think I need to interject something here, which I think is critical. It is true that you could do all the planning for a dispute and none arises. It is true. But it is also true that a single dispute could wipe away all the good that has developed and be the basis on which a company goes under.
Yes.
So it is one of those things like insurance, where you need to understand that you take insurance not because you're hoping for the worst,
Right.
but because you're preparing for it. It's an in the event of. So I would say persons need to understand dispute management by reference to this whole insurance concept. You're insuring against something which could likely happen, but may not. Consider yourself lucky if none arises. But ensure that if it does arise, you can say, thank God. I put arrangements in place that can help me to deal with this problem that we're now facing.
Why are the implications important to know? We are still going through the pandemic in some cases. Why are the implications important for discussion now?
The implications are important not because they were not always important. They have always been important. But I think now is a time, what has happened with COVID-19, and I say this, is that it has given us a chance with lockdowns and everything else to sort of step back a bit and to reassess.
Yes.
So I think now that we're in that process of being able to reassess, I think it is important for us to start thinking, what are some of the things that we may have taken for granted?
Yes.
And in that context, dispute resolution, I dare say, is something that a lot of companies and businesses and so on have taken for granted over time. So now is as good a time as any to say, here is COVID-19. It has brought about things that we never thought about, including by reference to disputes that we must resolve.
Yes.
So here is an opportunity to look at it, think about what we do, think about what our real risks are, and then understand that as we plan for the risks by reference to economic and other factors, we're also planning for the risks by reference to disputes, how they arise, how they may manifest, and what we can do about effectively resolving them.
Dr. Malcolm, some of those issues would have been raised during the JAIAC's Coffee Time series. We're going to take a quick look at some of the points raised in that series. So when we come back, we will continue our discussion about the JAIAC's role in dispute management, awareness, and implementation.
I would hope, as we did in September 11th in the United States, that there be an immediate I don't know who would bring it, convene insurance companies to try to come up with claims programs and distribution of insurance proceeds rather than fighting every case. Maybe we have IDB, maybe we have OECD, maybe we have the World Bank, maybe we have groups of nations come together. And then you can, it's easy. I mean, I've done it so many times. It's actually easy to categorize claims by the amount of loss, by the type of loss. You have a claims form system that's all online, of minimal proof of reality. There's rarely fraud actually in these claims programs, and focus not on liability, but on entitlement.
And with respect to entitlement, she's absolutely right that the model would be one focused on determining an appropriate pro rata distribution of a corpus of funds that's been determined necessary to compensate and or rehabilitate a group, an industry, a sector, a set of individuals, whoever it is that would be the beneficiaries of this tribunal and this model. The problem with that, though, is that last sentence, liability. Here we're talking about not an incident that can be labeled one that is the basis of someone's or a company's negligence, not one that's based upon the malfeasance or purposeful act of a group or entity or a state actor. We're talking about a virus. Who gets labeled, who gets tagged with the negative impact of a pandemic? Of course, the question, that necessarily will flow from that is this really, as Lucy was alluding to, an issue of liability per se, or is it just a question of insuring for unwanted consequence? Are we just merely saying, well, that's what insurance is for? That begs the question, are there exclusions that apply? The cases that are starting to arise with respect to business interruption claims are being forcefully met with defenses of exclusions, which typically would have exclusions for force majeure, unintended and unanticipated negative consequences, acts of God. Many would try to argue that a pandemic, a virus, something that is arguably not man-made, still, a pending question, would fit into that category, and those arguments are being made forcefully. So we, even within the insurance context, even when we're talking about avoiding liability in the traditional sense, in terms of either negligence or malfeasance or purposeful act, but we're talking about purely an insurance context.
Profound comments there from Miss Lucy Reed and Mr. Robert Vaughan, panelists from the Coffee Time series webinar hosted by the JAIAC. Dr. Malcolm, tell us a little bit about something you gathered from that webinar series that you want to share with us.
Coming out of that webinar, what was clear to me was the extent to which, regardless of where we are in the world, we were having common problems related to a pandemic that we had not previously had to deal with, anything like it. And that it was also clear that persons were having to grapple as dispute management practitioners with the idea of what now to do when everybody is suffering, when everybody is having a situation where we're all sustaining losses.
Right.
How do we redistribute those losses? How do we ensure that there's fairness? How do we ensure that we keep our economies going? How do we put systems in place that could refer, for example, to historical examples of panels and tribunals that have been set up prior to find solutions which were not necessarily all novel, but which were sufficiently geared to deal with what we had to deal with now. So that for me was a significant takeaway. And what was clear as well coming out of it was the extent to which it was clear that a lot of the more adversarial systems of litigation and even arbitration were no longer, at least not then anyway, as compatible with what our needs are as looking at more mediative and more amicable ways of resolving disputes. And I think the lesson, if I were to say the greater lesson going forward, is that we really should think in a very general way of how we may be able to avoid adversarial circumstances and try to find a way, not just when problems arise, but in a more general way of being more amicable. And it's like going to the doctor. You should not simply check up on your health and well-being when you're sick. You should very often put yourself in a position where you put systems in place to manage your health so that you avoid getting sick in the first instance, or even if you get sick, that you do not get as bad complications as you otherwise would have got had you not been taking proper care of yourself. And I think it's the same thing coming here. If we follow more amicable ways of resolving disputes and dealing with matters by way of proper management, what we're effectively doing is taking preventative action rather than back-end solutions. And very often by the time you get there, it is all daggers drawn.
I want you to tell me a little bit now about the JAIAC's role in implementation and awareness for dispute management.
Well, what the JAIAC, working together with other partners, has been doing over time is being involved in capacity building and helping persons to understand how best we can look at management rather than simply resolution in how we put systems together to protect our businesses and to protect ourselves as individuals. And there are training programs that we offer in addition to the regular systems for the resolution. Because as I said, we're not just about resolving. We're about putting persons in a position where they're better able to understand what their options are. And better able as well, having understood those options, to determine which ones they should use and in what circumstances. Because it is true that there is no one size that fits all. If you're training your horse to run 16 furlongs, do not have it run 8, it is going to lose. So in this situation, we're saying, let us allow you to choose what is appropriate based on what your needs are. And so the JAIAC is proactive in that way, in helping people not just to resolve, but how best to prepare for resolution.
You spoke just now about training opportunities. How are you managing to do that? Are some of these training opportunities online? How are you managing to do that?
Well, there's some that have been online, and the truth, as I said, is that we are not entire to ourselves. We have consistently worked with other partners, and collaboration is the name of the game.
What are some of the services, the training?
We've offered training services in the areas of mediation, in the areas of general conflict resolution, in the areas of arbitration, in the areas relating to facilitated contract renegotiation, in the areas of adjudication. So it's a host of training opportunities. And I like to think that one of the things to do here, very often training programs are sort of dispute resolution programs. I don't ever take that approach to training. I recognize that there's a very holistic approach. So every aspect of dispute resolution, be it arbitration, mediation, whatever you may think of, once it is not going through the courts, it is relating to a contract service being offered. So if persons do not understand the overarching framework within which contracts arise, the nature of the legal systems within which they function and so on, the training program is not as helpful as it could be. So the training and capacity building programs that we're involved in tend to be holistically designed to not just take you into trying to understand what mediation is about and so on, but to help you to understand the framework which allows for mediation to work well and for it to get the legal effect that you're hoping for.
Finally, we're almost out of time. How do persons contact the JAIAC if they're interested in doing one of these training courses?
Well, contacting the JAIAC is easy. If you send an email to info@jaiac.org, it will be answered. And you can also call 876-416-5390, and you can do this from wherever you are in the world, being reminded that we are not simply geared to serving the needs of Jamaica and the Caribbean.
Right.
We are here to serve the needs of an entire globe.
Dr. Malcolm, thank you very much for sharing with us.
And thank you for having hosted me, Anika.
Like we did in the beginning, we're going to wrap things up here, and we will give you a repeat of our quote. Dispute management, like peace, is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to resolve them. All of our podcast episodes on dispute management in the new world are available on Buzzsprout, Podbean, Spreaker, and the JAIAC's YouTube channel. Until then, I'm Anika Nelson on behalf of Dr. Christopher Malcolm, thanking you for joining us. What words come to mind when you hear dispute management? Procedure, resolution process, tribunal, economic development. And what are some of the underlying industries that use dispute management? Construction, for instance. Insurance, maritime, trade, investment, sports, and intellectual property are just a few. This program is produced with the kind sponsorship of the Jamaica Deposit Insurance Corporation, JDIC, protecting deposits for you and me.
I save because one day my little business is going to be a big deal.
Yeah, and I make sure to put away a little something for him.
And thanks to JDIC, deposit insurance protection on my savings gone up.
You've been upgraded. Deposits held in commercial banks, building societies, and merchant banks are covered under the JDIC Deposit Insurance Scheme up to $1.2 million per depositor per institution. JDIC.
Protecting deposits for you and me.
Special thanks to ADEB Consultants Limited, consulting engineers practicing for over 40 years. iNeutral, dispute resolution made easy. CP Malcolm Dispute Management Practitioner. Caribbean Institute of Alternative Dispute Resolution Limited, CIADR. Mona Law Faculty, the University of the West Indies, Mona. Impact Justice, improved access to justice in the Caribbean. Stay tuned to all our podcast episodes exploring the concept of dispute management, its appropriate use, options for stability in business relationships, and how it supports sustainable economic development. All our podcast episodes are distributed by these platforms: Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Deezer, Stitcher, Podcast Index, Pandora, TuneIn Plus Alexa, Podchaser, Podcast Addict, and wherever else you get your favorite podcasts.